service at Texas A&M University. This is our first talk of the year being delivered by Ambassador Wendy Chamberlin, my good friend and colleague of many years. We did this deliberately because, of course, it's the 20th anniversary of 9/11 just in a couple of days. We thought this would be fitting, an eyewitness account of the diplomacy in Pakistan, which of course allowed the U.S. intervention in Afghanistan. So let me just go through her biography here. Ambassador Chamberlain is a career Foreign Service officer. She served as the U.S. ambassador to Pakistan in 2001 and 2002, where she played a key role in securing the Pakistan government's cooperation in the U.S.-led campaign against al-Qaeda terrorists in Afghanistan. Her other leadership positions at state over her 29-year career included ambassador to Laos, the Charge d'Affaires in Malaysia, and senior positions in the Near East and counter-narcotics bureaus. She also served in Morocco, Malaysia, Laos, and Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. She was the director of global affairs under George H.W. Bush at the National Security Council, which meant she ultimately worked for Brent Scowcroft, our namesake of our institute. She was confirmed by the U.S. Senate, and I, as you know, proposed you, Wendy, to President Bush to be the head of our Middle East and Asia Bureau at the United States Agency for International Development while I was the administrator. And she reminded me the date, it was August of 2002. So she was actually in charge of both the reconstruction of Afghanistan and of Iraq. And so she got in after we'd started the Afghan reconstruction, but at the beginning of the planning for Iraq. She did that for until 2004 when she retired, and then took a position up in the one of the most powerful UN agencies, the High Commission for Refugees in Geneva, where she served as the deputy, which is the second ranking position in the agency. She supervised the administration of a more than $1 billion UN humanitarian organization, which I'm very fond of because they do very good work. And then she served for 12 years as the president of the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. Under her leadership, the 72-year-old institute tripled its endowment, added arts and a cultural center, and ranked among the top Middle East-focused think tanks in the United States by the University of Pennsylvania think tank rating system. Her legacy achievement, however, was to accomplish the renovation of the Institute's historic building. A couple of our students, as a matter of fact, got internships there while Wendy was there. She has a BS from Northwestern University and an MS in education from Boston University. She sits on the board of directors of the American University of Iraq at Sulaymaniyah. And so for those of you who've just tuned in, you can send questions. Many of you have already sent questions, which I will get to after she does her initial presentation. So Wendy, why don't you begin your talk?
Well, thank you very much, Andrew, and it's great seeing and talking to you again. You know, when you first asked me to speak at Texas A&M, I really jumped at the opportunity because I had a niece and 3 nephews who were alums at Texas A&M, and so I feel like I have a connection. But another thought occurred to me, and it occurred to you, as you've mentioned, and that is that it's really been 20 years now since I took up my posting as ambassador to Pakistan, and that was truly a year of crisis for Embassy Islamabad, because I arrived only a month before the 9/11 attack. And at that time of the attack, the embassy in Islamabad found itself really at the very center of the global war on terror. We really could not have known that 20 years later, we would come full circle. The Taliban would be back in Kabul, and there would be the emergence of another very deadly terrorist group, the Islamic State. Americans tend to play the blame game when facing policy failures. And this can be very healthy because it can educate policymakers and help prevent problems in the future, but it can also take the public down the wrong track and be a little misleading at times. Pakistan has been fingered in the media lately as one of the chief villains for the return of the Taliban, with some justification, and I'm not going to apologize for Pakistan, but there's more to that story. So tonight I want to do two things. First, I want to give a snapshot from an insider's point of view of Pakistan's instrumental role as a partner in the war on terrorism that led to the degradation of Al-Qaeda in 2001. I'll explain why Pakistan would not and has not cut its ties with the Taliban. And secondly, I'd like to give you, and more importantly, I'd like to give a blow-by-blow description of what it was like to be in an embassy during crisis, during an intense crisis. Some of the daunting challenges that our staff faced, some of the heartbreaking losses, and a few of the gratifying successes. So ultimately, I'd like to persuade Texas A&M students who might be joining us this evening to consider a career in diplomacy, to make a career of the Foreign Service in the service of others and your nation. So September 11, 2001, the day the world changed. You've heard that a lot this week. Most everybody who was alive then, and many of you students weren't, but we can remember where we were and what we were doing that morning of September 11. Here's what I remember. I remember walking from the Chancery, the embassy, to the ambassador's residence. It's a short walk. And I can remember looking up and seeing a flock of parrots, so green, so thick, that the blue sky turned green for a moment. And I can remember being anxious that evening because the Taliban had, a couple of weeks earlier, arrested two young girls from Waco, Texas, and thrown them into this hot, dank prison in Kabul, along with other fellow Christians. Proselytizing is a crime under Taliban Sharia law, and they have been distributing Bibles, charged with distributing Bibles. And it had concerned me because we did not have diplomatic relations with Afghanistan or the Taliban. And our embassy was responsible for consular affairs for any American citizen that happened to be in Afghanistan. So it was our responsibility. And several other events were troubling us. Just 2 days earlier, a couple of Al-Qaeda operatives posting themselves, disguising themselves as journalists, had hidden weapons inside their video camera and had murdered, assassinated Ahmed Shah Massoud, who was leader of the Northern Alliance, a group of northern tribes in Afghanistan that were waging a civil war against the Taliban. And this was a concern to us at the embassy because the CIA had been secretly backing Massoud in that bloody war in Afghanistan. Some analysts took this as just another violent act in the civil war, but I felt an ominous dread. I kind of had this feeling in my stomach that things were going to get much worse. And finally, I worried about my two teenage daughters. They're very young. I worried about raising them in Pakistan as a single mother. With many nights I would be gone with my diplomatic duties. So as I walked into the door of the embassy, my eldest daughter, who was up doing her homework in front of TV, shouted, "Mom, come quick. A plane has just crashed into the World Trade Center." So I rushed upstairs, and as I sank into the couch next to her, we watched together as the second plane brought down the second complex. And everything had changed. And I knew immediately that it was Osama bin Laden, it was Al-Qaeda. And that in the course of one morning in America, Pakistan and our embassy had become the center of the most challenging diplomatic crisis on the globe. It was indeed about to get much more complicated. This would be a year of crisis for the embassy in Islamabad that would come at us in a series of gut punches that hardly gave the staff time to catch their breath. But before I go any further, I think it's would be helpful to step back a minute and set the historical context of the nature of our bilateral relationship with Pakistan on that day of September 11. It was troubled, it was at rock bottom, and some of those troubles continue today for a number of reasons. First, the army, the Pakistan army, was the dominant and remains the dominant power in Pakistan. And this owes to the perpetual threat of war from India. The two neighbors had fought 3 hot wars since partition in 1947 over the control of Kashmir. Skirmishes along the Kashmir border, we call the line of control, were hot, and they continue today. Secondly, both adversaries had developed nuclear weapons over our objections, over American objections. And to discourage the proliferation of nuclear weapons, U.S. Congress in 1985 had passed legislation, the Presser Amendment, mandating that embassies cut economic and military aid to any country that went forward with developing a nuclear program. So for a decade, for over 10 years, Pakistan had suffered under the sanctions imposed under the Presser Amendment. And it had become a source of deep resentment among the population. So I faced a rather serious anti-American sentiment in the country when I arrived. And finally, the Army's close relationship with the Taliban was a friction point in our bilateral relations. The U.S. opposed the Taliban for being ruthless, anti-democratic regime that harbored terrorist organizations, namely Al-Qaeda. And to our great dissatisfaction, Pakistan Army based its core defense doctrine on friendly relations with the Taliban. Throughout that year, I would hear General Musharraf explain to American visitors countless times the basis of their defense strategy, which they called strategic depth. He would explain that Pakistan was a long, narrow country, and that a land attack by Indian troops from the east could cut off Pakistan's major cities, its capital in the north, from its port in Karachi within days, maybe hours. And this worried them a great deal. The Pakistan Army wanted to have strategic depth so that its troops could have room to maneuver, could retreat into the west, into Afghanistan, if faced with advancing hostile forces from India. And they also, strategic depth also meant that they want to have a friendly government in Kabul so that to put a check on Indian involvement from Afghanistan that would squeeze, do mischief and squeeze Pakistan from both east and west, as is happening today, frankly, in Balochistan. So this was the dismal state of U.S. Pakistan relations when I agreed to serve as the U.S. ambassador. It had really reached rock bottom. But despite these obstacles, I had reasons to look forward to it. And Andrew can tell you why. I'm a humanitarian at heart, and I saw this as a humanitarian mission, one in which the embassy in Islamabad would be dealing with a constant flow of Afghanistan refugees into Pakistan. In early 2001, USAID had sent a team to Afghanistan and had reported that there would be, and predicted that there would be widespread famine by December of 2001, that the benighted Taliban regime that blocked world food programs, that cut off food deliveries, 3 years of drought, and the civil war itself had all contributed to a devastating food shortage throughout the country. The irony, of course, is that today, as the Taliban move back into Kabul, they face another food insecurity for almost the same reasons. But by the time I arrived in Islamabad by mid-2001, August of 2001, nearly 200,000 desperate Afghans had already started to pour across the border into Pakistan. And the Pakistanis were forcibly collecting these refugees, putting them into a holding tank and threatening to repatriate them back into Afghanistan, push them back, which is against international law. And I knew that this would become another major friction in our bilateral relations. So on the first weekend I was there, made a little visit to the border, made a visit to the Jalazai camp in Peshawar. This little adventure outside of Islamabad could have gone terribly wrong for me. That the Pakistan government could have made it into a major diplomatic incident because I had conducted official business, they could claim, before formally presenting my credentials, which is not protocol. In fact, General Musharraf was then told to watch out for the new ambassador because she's aggressive. Much to my relief, the gambit worked in our favor. General Musharraf invited me to dinner. We stayed up late into the evening. He shared his vision for Pakistan, his fears about the rot of terrorism that would come from Afghanistan into Pakistan, and his desire to build the economy through export-led growth of textiles mostly. And I made my pitch on behalf of refugees and girls' education. This meeting wasn't so important for what was said, but it was critically important that we had met and gotten to know each other and established a relationship based on trust. And just how important that meeting was would become strikingly evident in just 2 short weeks. So let's bring the story now back to the evening of September 11, when we first learned of the attack. I'd been involved in crisis management back in the State Department and knew the steps. The first step is to assemble an interagency team to monitor the crisis and report back to the home agency back in Washington. Our second step was to open up a telephone line with the embassy's Consul General, David Donahue, who was in Kabul. He was there trying to get the release of the girls, the missionaries. But the most important mission of a task force in a crisis is to gather reliable information. But I knew that implicitly this crisis was very much unlike any that I'd worked in the past, because the crisis was in Washington, not abroad. One of the early rumors that we had picked up was that a bomb had exploded with shrapnel in front of the State Department, just as our friends and colleagues were pouring out of the State Department under evacuation instructions to go home. And we could only imagine the chaos within the department. So we knew we were on our own. So I made one call to Washington to find out what was happening. And I called the one man I knew who would be calm in a crisis and be on top of the events. And that was Richard Clark. He was President Bush's senior advisor for counterterrorism. And he instantly took my call. I had called on him in July, just before leaving Washington. And Dick's red hair was on fire at that time. Bin Laden is planning an attack on the US somewhere. I don't know where, I don't know when, but it's going to be big. So I knew he'd been tracking this pretty closely. And in the 15 years that I had been working with Dick, I'd never seen him so certain of anything nor so frustrated. He was desperate then to head off the Al-Qaeda attack and had pushed hard to arm the Predator, a Predator drone, to take out Osama bin Laden before the attack could occur, and hoping to prevent it, but no clear-cut opportunity ever presented itself. In our first call, Dick was also concerned that from the very outset, the Defense Department had immediately started insisting that it was Saddam Hussein who was behind the attack, and Dick knew it was Al-Qaeda. On September 13, I was to present my credentials. I had the official appointment with General Musharraf. And I went with instructions from Secretary Powell. My mission was to persuade this proud military leader to risk his position, perhaps his life, certainly to upturn his defense doctrine of strategic depth. And on top of that, I was instructed to use language which I feared would be seen as threatening to him. You were either with us or against us. Dutiful to the letter, and ambassadors are, I delivered the instructions word for word. Musharraf responded with a long-winded, meandering remarks that avoided the obvious point. And I tried again several times. And I said, General, I know you're with us because look, we met earlier, we talked. I know what your vision is for your country. We have a concurrence here of needs and obligations. So you tell me what you need from the United States in order to achieve it. Again, he skirted the issue. And after about an hour, I could see where it's just not going anyway. And a knot started tightening in my stomach. And I kind of half turned away from him. And I put my head in my hands and my elbows on my knees. And I'm thinking to myself, holy cow, what am I going to do now? And I heard him say, Wendy, what's wrong? So I whipped around and I said, frankly, General, I have not heard what I need to hear to tell my president. And at that point, he said, well, I support you unstintingly. And I immediately got up, thanked him very much, and ended the meeting. I didn't want to have any further waffling. And as I'm walking down the very elaborate corridor in the presidential palace, I see at the end of the hall two figures, Tom Mintier from CNN and his cameraman. And I have to make up my mind within a moment. Do I tell the world before I tell the president and Secretary Powell? And I say, yes, I do. And I did, because that locked in General Musharraf to his commitment to support us. After that, for the rest of the week, the ball was in Musharraf's court. He now faced, as a hardened, battled general, he now faced one of the toughest adversaries of his career. He had to convince his public and his army that he'd made the right decision in supporting us. So he held a series of town hall meetings with Pakistan's top opinion leaders, the military, the government, the tribal leaders, the governors, the religious leaders. And he laid out his position and he heard their concerns. By the end of the week, he had a pretty fair idea where his red lines were in his political situation. So he asked to meet me again late in the evening on September 15. And it had really been a long week. Days never seemed to end, just as our work was coming to an end at the embassy, and we could quit and go home. Washington was waking up and the phone would ring all night long, making it very difficult for our staff to sleep. So exhausted, I went to the residence of the chief of army where he stayed, and I sunk into a big yellow chair, and he started to lay out his concerns. He stressed several times, these are not conditions, these are not demands, these are simply concerns. I thought that was a good sign. First, no Indian armed forces should overfly Pakistan, understood. Second, Pakistan would allow American military flights over its airspace, which we had to do to get the landlocked Afghanistan, but we would not base, could not base American ground troops on Pakistani soil. And finally, most significantly, Pakistan would assist America in going after Al-Qaeda and bin Laden, but if any Pakistani citizens were caught in the net, they were his responsibility. He said nothing about the Taliban. The next day, the chief of the Army's powerful inter-service intelligence, ISI, Mahmoud Khan, wanted to talk to me. General Khan, Mahmoud, we called him, had just returned from Washington and in fact was up on Capitol Hill sitting inside a congressman's office at the time of the 9/11 attack. And he was still in shock from what he witnessed. He recounted the scene with great passion of panic and chaos that had engulfed the Capitol. He said, I could see the black smoke coming out of billowing out of the Pentagon and could hear sirens from all directions. And I was I was so hopeful then that Mahmoud's shared experience with the American public would make him an ally, because no other person in the Pakistan army was more important than the chief of the ISI. But then he turned to the dark side of his trip, and he said he was deeply offended by a meeting that he'd had at the State Department. I've never been treated so rudely in my life. And I didn't try to defend or apologize for a conversation that I had not been briefed on, but my heart did sink. I thought, oh boy, whatever was said or not said, America may have lost the support of this important person. But after a while, Mahmoud turned to the real purpose of his meeting. He made an energetic case in defense of the Taliban. He says, I know Mullah Omar, he doesn't want bin Laden in Afghanistan. He'd like to get rid of him. He only tolerates them because it's Pushtun culture to extend hospitality to visitors. Well, I didn't buy it. We in fact knew that the ties that bound bin Laden and Mullah Omar were very practical. Taliban depended heavily on al-Qaeda for arms supply, for training, for recruitment of foreign fighters, and that the civil war with the Northern Alliance was stalemated, and he really couldn't cut ties with al-Qaeda. Bin Laden made sure of that by assassinating Ahmad Saleh Massoud 2 days before, which really tightened that noose. Still, Mahmoud asked the US to give the Taliban one more chance to turn bin Laden over, for the Taliban to turn bin Laden over to us and avoid becoming a target of Operation Enduring Freedom. He offered to travel to Kandahar and meet with Omar personally to make the case, which he did. And of course, his mission failed. So we worried that Mahmoud and a few other ISI officers might go rogue and work against Musharraf's commitment to help us. Fortunately, Musharraf had come to that same conclusion. And by October 7, the night that the bombing began in Kabul, Musharraf had maneuvered Mahmoud from his position and into retirement, giving us further confidence that we had a solid partner. The Taliban had not been a party with al-Qaeda to the World Trade Center attack, but the decision to continue to harbor al-Qaeda, despite opportunities to cut that tie, meant that they were against us. And for the following 20 years, our policy, the US policy, would be to press Pakistan to cut those ties with the Taliban. It was becoming increasingly evident to us that the success of our mission to go after al-Qaeda depended on this partnership with Pakistan and on Musharraf's continued leadership on this one man. But the Pakistani public needed a very clear signal that he was on the right course. And Washington acted quickly, acted fast. President Bush lifted Pakistan's sanctions on September 22nd. And this was a huge morale boost for the beleaguered country. This time, in making his announcement, President Bush said, quote, our policy is to support those who support us on the war of terrorism. The most welcome bonanza was the timely distribution of $600 million in grant funds. The sum may seem small by measures of the amount of money we've spent on Iraq and Afghanistan over the last 20 years, but it was an astounding got a message here that I was muted. In any case, I'll assume I'm not. The IMF, our support in the IMF and the World Bank also was extremely important to them and offered them a lifeboat economically. Embassy security became a consuming concern. Public opinion in a nation of 220 million people doesn't really turn on a dime. And anti-American sentiment was running deep in that decade before 9/11, so the critics, Musharraf's critics were quick to organize. And at one point, the protesters reached crowds of 100,000 in Karachi. Washington was worried, and we were worried that mobs would breach our compound walls at the embassy, as it had in 1979 when it burned down our embassy. I was asked to reduce our staff by 2/3, but from where I sat, we needed more staff, not fewer. So instead of shrinking the size of the embassy, we ballooned by hundreds, crammed into small spaces in our embassy. Most of the temporary people who came at that time were military planners and intel officers. The most difficult part, though, of enhanced security measures was the ordered departure of all of our dependents. We had to pack up our families, our spouses, our children, and send them away for an indeterminate amount of time. And when the situation was most intense, officers had to scramble to find housing and schooling and childcare for their families back home. Our pets, our dogs were a big concern. And I suffered along with everyone else in the mission. I had to pack up my 2 young daughters and send them home chaperoned by one of the other mothers. So the war begins. By early October, the drums of war were getting louder. 3,000 journalists and media crews descended on Islamabad in anticipation of a strike in Kabul. And while I had full confidence that the US military would quickly oust the Taliban from Kabul, as they did, I was deeply worried about the 2 imprisoned missionary girls who were still in jail in Kabul with their German and Australian colleagues, just as the bombing was about to begin. When the bombing did start and the Taliban fled Kabul, they moved the missionaries down to Ghazni, a city about 80 miles away, and they didn't know what to do with them. So they put them in a shipping container, locked it, and fled. Horrible to think what their fate may have been, but they were discovered by some anti-Taliban fighters, and a rescue plan quickly came together. We got the message to them to go to a nearby soccer field at the night, to hide out, wait till the nighttime, go to a nearby soccer field and plant a fire at each corner of the soccer field to signal to special forces helicopters who would come to rescue them. The women took off the burqas that the Taliban had given them to fuel the fires. But Taliban forces were prowling all throughout the area. It was very dangerous rescue mission, and it was terrifying. So our small group of senior officers at Islamabad spent the entire evening our ears glued to the crackle of a satellite radio, monitoring every movement of the rescue team. The horrifying part of it was that this was not a thriller movie. This was real life. Never, remembering it, thinking back of that evening, have I felt such abject despair when the first flight of the helicopters over the field saw nothing, the second flight saw nothing, the third pass saw nothing, and the concern was that the helicopters would leave. But no, we heard the pilots say, well, we'll keep trying. They saw the fires, they landed in the field, and for excruciating minutes, which seemed like hours, nobody appeared. And then suddenly they saw these figures running in from the brush, and the girls were rescued. You can imagine the shouts of joy around our little radio, and how elated we were when I was able to go to the airport and meet them and take them back to the residence and give them a nice hot shower. We got a lot of visitors in the next few weeks and months. Secretary Powell came in mid-October, and he was one of the first and most significant of the many visitors, including Andrew Natsios came to visit me. But Powell's party provided a huge morale boost. And I have to admit that I found it enormously amusing that his security people said he couldn't really stay in the hotel, so he had to stay at the residence. And I found it amusing that these senior officers and the secretary himself were bunked down in bedrooms with stuffed animals and nail polish and other precious belongings of young teenage girls. I was confident then that Powell would establish a good relationship bond with General Musharraf, and he did. But I was really worried about the formal dinner that I would have that first night after he arrived. Heads of state don't usually go to ambassadors' houses for dinner, so this was kind of a big deal. I spent the first day of the visit escorting the secretary around town, but I noticed that by noon, my cook had not shown up. Finally, by 3 o'clock, he finally shows up to put on this big dinner. And I said, "Where have you been?" And he says, "Well, so sorry, madame." He says, "My teenage son, he ran off to join the Taliban to kill Americans in Afghanistan." And I said, "Well, what did you do?" And he says, "Well, I found him and I grabbed him and I threw him in a room and I beat him." And I really didn't have anything else to say at that point. We were to learn later that imam from one of the more notorious radical mosques acted like a Pied Piper, luring hundreds of young Pakistani men off to Afghanistan, where they really became cannon fodder and put in the first lines and were the first to die. It was really sad, but created some anti-Taliban sentiment in Pakistan. The secretary's visit was the first of many delegations. At one point, we calculated that half of the Senate had come to Islamabad in those first few weeks. By November, the staff was completely exhausted. A combination of reduced personnel, an anthrax scare, a constant stream of visitors and changing, but mostly the stress of not having your families there had really taken a toll. Bin Laden was a hunted man. He and his fighters fled to a complex of caves in Tora Bora, located in the rugged mountains between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And I think you all are well aware that the U.S. forces that raided the Tora Bora complex didn't send enough people. And unfortunately, Al-Qaeda leader had slipped away. He was found 15 years later, right under the nose of Pakistani military in Abbottabad, raising the suspicions that the Pakistanis knew where he was. And I have no way of knowing about this. But I can attest from firsthand knowledge that by late November of 2001, General Musharraf was eager and willing to deploy as many as 60,000 regular U.S. Pakistani troops along the border. And I can remember very well that conversation where it had come up. I was accompanying General Tommy Franks, who was the Central Commander of Centralcom, up to visit Musharraf. And Musharraf says to him, he says, "General Franks," he says, "from one military man to another, what are you doing? What is your plan to catch bin Laden?" And Musharraf explained that there were 150 valleys along that border that was 1,500 miles long, and that these Al-Qaeda were spilling into these valleys. And Musharraf said, "I don't want these terrorists here. What is your plan to stop them?" Franks sat quietly. Musharraf continued, "I'll deploy the 60,000 troops, but I can't get them there by roads. There are no roads. I need airlift." Again, Franks said nothing. And of course, I, again, had no insight into what complicated considerations the general faced as he was juggling many different priorities. But years later, we did hear reports that CENTCOM had already been instructed to begin planning for an invasion of Iraq. And I can only suppose that Pakistan may have seen Frank's hesitation as a sign that the U.S. would, what they would perceive as abandoning them in Afghanistan once again, after we had done it with the successful eviction of the Soviets in 19 1989. And that would lead the Pakistanis to hedge their bets by maintaining ties with the Taliban and resisting our entreaties to break those ties. Well, 2 weeks later, just take a little glass of water here. 2 weeks later, after that conversation, another crisis erupted. This one was existential. On December 5th, a Pakistani-based terrorist group, Jaish-e-Mohammed, planted a bomb in front of the Indian parliament in New Delhi, killing 7 people. And Indians, probably rightly, saw the hand of Pakistan's ISI behind this terrorist attack. In response, India deployed 500,000 troops along the Pakistani border, clearly threatening a land invasion. And this crisis took a terrifyingly serious turn when both India and Pakistan then deployed their mobile nuclear weapons along that border. Needless to say, for those of us sitting in Islamabad, knowing that it only took 7 minutes for a nuclear weapon, once shot at, to land in Islamabad, demolish the capital city, it was a little unsettling. Secretary Powell intensely mediated the crisis over the Christmas holiday, and he succeeded. Musharraf promised to shut down the domestic terrorist groups, and the Indians pulled back their troops and nuclear weapons. By New Year's Eve, December 31st, the infamous year of 2001 was coming to a happy note. The announcement of that Powell had succeeded came out, and crowds erupted in the streets of Islamabad, spontaneous demonstrations, this time out of relief and joy. I had been invited to a New Year's Eve party at the Marriott Hotel with other ambassadors in the diplomatic corps. And as the evening went on, we noticed that gradually the crowds from the streets began to infiltrate into the ballroom. And I glanced around, a little nervous. I glanced around and made sure that my Pakistani police officer, who was assigned for my protection, was nearby, and he was. Sort of one more spin around the dance floor with my dance partner, the Egyptian ambassador, and I caught the eye of this scruffy-looking guy in a dirty shalwas kameez, only about 5 feet away from me. His eyes locked on mine, and he reached into his cloak. Instinctively, I lunged at him, and he didn't expect such an aggressive move, so he immediately turned around and ran out, knocking people on the ground like dominoes. And the Egyptian ambassador turned to me and said, it's time for you to go home. It was getting a little rougher there in Islamabad at that point. But the world's attention that week now focused intensely on General Musharraf. The Indians had pulled back their nuclear weapons, but Musharraf needed to make an announcement, and that speech was scheduled for January 12th to denounce domestic terrorist groups and say that he would begin to dismantle them. Musharraf faced blistering resistance from his military commanders, particularly the ISI, who was adamant that he make no promise to disband the groups. From my point of view, the more they protested, the more guilty they seemed. But Musharraf was caught in a vice. He'd made this promise to Powell, and yet he depended upon the army for his base support, because they actually had put him in office in a military coup 2 years earlier. I spent that week before the speech making presentations to his advisors and various officials, impressing on them how important it was that he deliver a very strong speech. And at some point, some of his advisors and speechwriters would show me their drafts, and I would say, no, it has to be tougher. I got some blowback from my own staff saying that I was coaching. I really thought that this was much more important to draw some very clear red lines, to worry about diplomatic orthodoxy. According to the press, Musharraf had a horrific confrontation with his military corps commanders. 3 days before the scheduled speech, tempers flared, and at one point, Musharraf threatened to resign. And then the officers backed down and accepted the core message of his draft speech. On the night of the speech, it was tough. CNN led with the headline, "Pakistan's leader comes down hard on extremists," and the White House put out a statement, "Bush welcomes Pakistan's commitment to fight terrorists." But the question remained, what action would Pakistan do to dismantle the groups? And I reflected back on that conversation that I'd had that first week on September 15, where he said that if Pakistani citizens were caught in the net, they were his responsibilities. He'd only agreed to support us with Al-Qaeda, and I worried. To be frank, over the last 20 years, we've been disappointed with the effort to shut down the homegrown terrorist groups, which they continued to value as proxy fighters against India. In contrast, Pakistan cooperation throughout the rest of 2002 to locate, arrest, and turn over to us Al-Qaeda operatives was superb. It was impressive. Pakistani ISI and police worked hand in hand with our FBI and CIA to find and shut down the safe houses in Pakistan. The nuclear war had been averted, but another phase of the war, this time war on terror, had moved inside Pakistan. I had met a number of journalists in the course of the year, but none impressed me as much as Danny Pearl of the Wall Street Journal. And to my horror, Danny was kidnapped by terrorists on January 23rd. We worked at the embassy fervently, passionately to try to track down his kidnappers. We hoped we could repeat the rescue that we had done with the missionaries and rescue Danny. But the FBI and the CIA were led down a number of blind alleys. Finally, on our worst fears came to pass on February 21st, when the terrorist released a gruesome video of his beheading. I refused to watch it. Danny's beheading should have been a wake-up call for me. Maybe I deluded myself into thinking it was a one-off case. Right at that time, Washington was considering the return of our families. And a case could be made that the threat that had sent the families home in September no longer existed. There was no massive demonstrations in the streets or fear that mobs would come over our compound walls. And I had selfish reasons to support the decision to bring the families back, because my daughters were not doing very well with the separation, and I really wanted them with me. The families did return, but again, then I began, the indications of a worsening security situation increased. In early March, I invited the Women's Club, American Women's Club, for a tea in the residence and to give them a security briefing. And I confessed to them, I said, frankly, I worry that the embassy can no longer assure your protection or the protection of your family. So please think about your own security and that of your children in everything you do. And I can remember standing in front of the group, locking eyes with the president of the American Women's Club. 1 week later, she would be dead in a terrorist suicide bombing. An Al-Qaeda suicide bomber, the first Al-Qaeda suicide bomber in Pakistan, exploded himself in the Protestant church on March 17, killing Barbara Green and her beautiful 17-year-old daughter, Christian Wormsley. It shook up the international community. And our staff had been through a lot that year, one blow after another, but I instinctively knew that communities don't come together after a tragedy like the church bombing. The unity was shattered. We could never return to that, put ourselves back together. For a moment, we did reunite during a moving memorial service. Milton Green and his son bravely participated in that tribute to their lost wife, mother, sister. And I can remember saying that I could only hope to be that kind of mother that Barbara was the day when she threw her own body over her son, Zach, saving his life. I left Pakistan with the other families this time to take my daughters home. Back in Virginia, I can remember my heart broke as I was driving my 7th grader back to her middle school. And she says, you know, Mom, this is my first day of 7th grade. One of her teachers actually left her class to come as I was in the administrative office enrolling her to say, you know, you've got to come home. And I knew she was right. There were many competent Foreign Service officers who could be ambassador to Pakistan. There was only one person who was mother to my daughters. So I returned to Pakistan, but curtailed by the end of May. And a few weeks later, I began a new assignment, one that was challenging and exciting, my career, and working with one of my favorite bosses, and that was Andrew Natsios. So Andrew, thank you.
Thank you. That's a remarkable story, Wendy, about both the personal observations, but the anecdotes of dealing with Sharif and the rest of the Pakistani military leadership and the sequence of events. I'll just add a couple of my own. After, I think it was 3 weeks after 9/11, Connie Rice called me, Pete Payson, who was the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and Richard Haas, who was the head of the think tank in the State Department called Policy and Planning, as you know. Richard has been the head of the Council on Foreign Relations for what, 20 years now, or 15 years now. Anyway, we were waiting to go into her office, and I said, why are we here? And Pete Page said, I don't know. And Richard said the same thing. We went in and Condi said, you're here because we are going to put AID out in front. We do not want to look like we were invading like the Russians invaded, but liberating the country from Al-Qaeda and from the Taliban. And so, Andrew, you are going to be much more visible, and that's where I'm here to tell you. And so you're leaving for the countries north of Pakistan, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan, and then Kyrgyzstan. And they gave me a military plane to take me around. And then I made the first trip of a senior American official into Afghanistan in 10 years. And I flew in deliberately. I chose to go into General Massoud's home city where he was assassinated to send a message. And we went in with heavy armaments. I'll never forget the armament. We flew down at one of those valleys, but this was over the
Panjshir Valley.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
And we, the interesting thing is that was the river that Alexander the Great crossed when he conquered Afghanistan in the third century BC. Mm-hmm. So it's in my memory of classical history was that river is very historically important. We had already started aid programs in the home city to start reconstruction but I remember the chaotic conditions, and we were looking at a Food for Peace warehouse. Food for Peace is the food program of AID of the U.S. government. And there were two guys with me who were clearly CIA. I knew who they were. And they had huge bags. And they looked like machine guns, frankly. They were black bags. And I remember it was 8 o'clock in the evening. I was looking through the food stocks and talking to the AID offices there. And the CIA guy said, Mr. Natsios, we need to leave. It's dark out now, and they're going to try to assassinate you. I said, I beg your pardon? And they said, well, Al-Qaeda takes the city over at night, and then they leave during the day. And they're coming in now, and they're looking for you. And you need, I said, it'll take a half an hour to get out of here. He said, no, it won't. We call the helicopters right out on the other side of this wall. They're waiting to get you out of here and get us out of here before something bad happens. And so I was flown out almost instantly from that city. I could tell more stories about what happened in the city and all that, but I want to start asking you some questions.
Well, no, I'd just like to point out, Andrew, that wasn't the first time that they They wanted to assassinate you. Didn't you almost get
in
assassinated in
Iraq.
Darfur? And
Yeah, and then there was an attempt to, when I went my last trip in December of 2005, before I retired as aid administrator in January 2006 to teach at Georgetown, I asked the CIA for a briefing, and the director of counterterrorism said, they are going to try to kill you. We've gotten messages already, because they regard AID as a huge threat to their appeal in Afghanistan. And we suggest that you announce you're arriving when you're on your way out of the country. I said, what? He said, don't announce you're going into the country until after you've left, which is what we did. We kept it very secret, and we didn't have any incidents, but that sort of, so it's the beginning and the end of my
it's
time
a
as
little
administrator.
unnerving, yeah.
Yeah, it was interesting. So anyway, let me go back and ask some questions. Jim Beaver, who was the mission director at the beginning and then at the end in Afghanistan, asked me, he said, looking back at U.S. relations, Pakistan and India, and given the Taliban's control in Afghanistan, what lessons should we take to guide us forward in minimizing instability, terrorism, nuclear proliferation in South Asia? In other words, what would you take from these 20 years? I have to say, I'm very, very upset over what's happened. But give me tell me the lessons that you take from all of this.
Well, that's about the toughest question, and I think you could ask any policymaker. How do you make the world a safer place?
Right.
We've certainly tried everything in Afghanistan, haven't we? We've tried we've tried military force. We've tried pouring in, well, billions of dollars in aid. We've tried diplomacy. We've tried negotiating with the Taliban. Nothing has seemed to work. And I think that's what's behind Jim's question. What would work? I think a little humility works. We can't, and I blame myself too, because from the very beginning of this, I thought, well, we can fix this. We can fix Pakistan. We can fix Afghanistan. No, we can't. And I think a little humility that there are deeper forces, deeper trends that you just won't change, that it's a longer process that begins with really understanding the culture and working with the culture, which was why I spent some time telling the story of my discussion with Musharraf. Are you against us? I know you're with us. What do you need from us? Where is the Venn dialogue overlap? Where can we work together? And not, this is what we need you to do. You know, we need you to open up schools for girls. We need you to break relations with the Taliban. Demands don't get you there, but working on mutual needs, mutual goals is a better approach in my view.
Well, it's interesting. We sent Mark Ward in to be the first mission director since we had closed the mission down in Pakistan over the nuclear issue. And there was an assassination message. The CIA said they're going to try to kill him. And I said, Mark, you have to stop jogging in the mornings. You can't do that anymore. It's too dangerous. But he really started the program back up. And when I went to Islamabad around the city, I think this is after you had left, but I know maybe you were still there. And people came up to me and said, we're so glad AID is back, because AID had a very good reputation in the city, and it was a good representative for America, not on I don't like to say the soft side, because that shows weakness. That is not what AID is. It's not a soft agency. It's a non-military agency, but it can be very powerful. And I met with one of the leaders of the Islamic fundamentalists. They were not Taliban, but he was elected, and Musharraf was very suspicious of him out in the tribal area, near the tribal area. And I asked to see him just to see what would be. He was a young guy, probably 40 years old. And I let him talk, and I said, I'm not going to have my people killed by your people. well, we would never do that. I said, well, yes, you would. You've done it elsewhere. And and if you're not welcoming us, then we're going to leave your area. We can go somewhere else in Pakistan. And he said, we do not want you to leave. We agree with all you're doing. We just do not want you teaching religion in the schools. I said, we don't teach religion in the schools anywhere because it's against the separation of church and state, which means religion and state in the United States. So we don't do that. And he said, we like the health programs, we like the education programs, we like the agriculture programs. Please stay. And he did seem to be sincere about it. And Pakistan, the Taliban said the same thing. The problem is, and this is what I want to ask you, can we justify an aid program in Afghanistan with a ruling government that treats women and minorities and dissenters the way they do? We're appearing to see this right now. Or should we just say we cannot work in a country where the government is so brutal? What do you think?
Well, I think that is the question that we'll be struggling with over the next weeks and months. And I'm going to leave it to people who are in much higher positions than I am. But I think that we should put a pin in that decision and see just what happens in Afghanistan, just what the Taliban do over the next weeks and months before we make any judgments. This is a different Taliban. This is 20 years later. Right. When they came into Kabul 20 years ago, they took Najibullah, as you recall, who was the Soviets supported leader of the country, and dismembered him and dragged him through the streets and hung him. Yeah. They have not done that. In fact, we're talking to them. They're allowing some flights, and a couple of dozen people, Americans, were allowed to leave. They're working with us. They are much more sophisticated now than they were then. They know the importance of not being a pariah. I'm not saying I've made up my mind about the Taliban, but I'm saying I think we should all keep an open mind.
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't think we should jump, but I am deeply suspicious, I have to tell you. However, I do think we should wait and see what they actually do. They're talking with Abdullah. Abdullah was the foreign minister under the last government, and Karzai didn't leave either, former president. So that surprised me that Karzai would feel secure enough to stay in the country under these circumstances. Mm-hmm. How much did you work with the intelligence community? I mean, they report the CIA station chief obviously reported to you, but how critically important were they? I mean, were they at the center of this?
You mean our intelligence?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, hand in hand. One of the things that any successful ambassador understands is that they don't represent the State Department, even though you may be a career State Department officer, as I was. You were appointed by the president and confirmed by Congress for all of the agencies of the U.S. government. And so my accountability and my authority was to support the mission of the CIA, the military, the Drug Enforcement Agency, the Commerce Department, just as equally and fairly as my State Department officers. It became, very quickly, it became an intelligence mission, the rescue, for example. And one of the first things first decisions I made is, how do we implement this new partnership with the military, Pakistan military? Well, they did not want U.S. troops on Pakistan soil, particularly in Pakistan bases. So how do we get American soldiers, American military people working with Pakistan military people to actually implement the deconfliction of airplanes, to implement the way we would cooperate with their military in this new venture? Where do you do it if you can't do it on Pakistani soil? So I cleared off our unclassified conference room, and we established a joint military hub, which became an intelligence hub, inside the embassy. And the roof of the embassy was just loaded with radar equipment and telecom equipment, and which you had to do, which usually embassies don't allow,
Yeah.
because it raises suspicions. And I have to say, just one more comment on that, that I found it very amusing to what the Chinese embassy officers who had the embassy right next to us thought as they would ride by our embassy and see all these radars, dishes up on top of our embassy. So very close. In fact, I would, as you know, hundreds of intel officers, American intel officers, would pass through the embassy in the time I was there. I would actually cut down the real estate within the embassy, real estate office space within the embassy to make room for them. And for the most part, the State Department people were very accommodating.
That's good. What do you think is going to happen in terms of the Pakistani military now that the Taliban is in power? I mean, are they going to have their own headaches with them, or they've achieved their objective? What's their new objective?
There's Taliban and there's Taliban and there's Taliban. As you recall, the TTP is bitter enemy with the Pakistan embassy, and that's Taliban. And as you recall, a couple of years ago, an element of the Taliban attacked that high school in Peshawar and went in and killed students. Those were the kids of the Pakistani military. And so there's no love lost there. However, the suspicion has always been, the charge has always been that the Pakistan Army has provided sanctuary for Hekmatyar, for Hekmatyar, but also the Haqqani group, which we felt attacked and killed Americans. I'm distressed. This gives some credence to your suspicions that the Taliban may be just as bad as usual. That Haqqani is now Minister of Interior in the new ministry there. And that's a bad sign. But so it's complicated. There's Taliban and there's Taliban.
Right. Well, we are 15 minutes over the 6 o'clock end to this, but let me just encourage you to edit your comments the way you want them. And I would like to publish this because I think for the historical record, your memories and your description of what happened is very important, Wendy. But thank you for being with us this evening and for kicking off our school year talks.
Well, thank you. And again, I feel this connection to Texas A&M from my niece and my nephews.
And your grandparents, you told me your grandparents are from Texas. So
yeah, the whole family. My two brothers live here. Sort of.
Good. Maybe if the pandemic is ever over, that you can come in person and be with us, maybe for a few days. You know, Ambassador Larry Napper, who was ambassador to Kazakhstan, when I went up, he reminded me when I arrived at the Bush School, said, Andrew, you met me in your office on your famous trip just after 9/11, and he is a diplomat in residency for many years.
Oh, wonderful.
Senior diplomat.
No, Larry. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. And
Thank
you to all of you people who've sat through this hour. I appreciate your audience.
Thank you. Bye.
Mm-hmm. Bye.
Very good, Wendy. Done very, very well. That went